The Sony FX30. Who is this for? Hello, my name is Jonathan Palfrey. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe as always, as it massively helps me out. Now, I haven't done an episode pretty much at all this month. It's because I've been away, very busy shooting abroad. It's been a great shoot, but I was so busy and just didn't get a chance to put a video together, which is really frustrating because I've got loads of content that I want to share with you. However, I'm going to try and catch up, and I'm going to start off with my reactions to the release of the Sony FX30. Now, I don't unfortunately have one of these in my hand. I'd love if Sony would ever send me one of their cameras. Hopefully one day that will be the case. But sadly, this is just the FX3. I say just, it's an amazing camera that I absolutely love shooting for the last few weeks. So you've probably seen all the videos out there about the FX30 and the specs and everything about the camera, so I don't really need to go all over that again. I did think about whether it's even worth making this video because you're probably pretty FX30'd out at this stage. But I really wanted to share my opinions, my ideas, and really just sort of bounce off you guys about whether the FX30 is a camera that I would want to buy or whether I should be recommending to you guys to purchase, based purely on the features that it has versus the other options that Sony offer. Sony are marketing this as their entry-level cinema camera, and it makes a lot of sense. It makes it a lot more affordable than what the FX3 was, but giving you still all the same features that that camera offered. If you don't know already, it is pretty much an FX3. It is optional, the top handle, you don't have to buy that, which is nice that you have that as an option now rather than being forced to buy it if you didn't say want it. But in terms of the body design, in terms of the functionality, it is very similar. The only real difference is that sensor. That sensor, of course, means a slightly different image quality. It's going to give you a slightly different look. So it does bring up some big questions about which camera you should buy. Now, when it comes to competition outside of Sony, well, it's competing with the likes of the Panasonic GH6, as well as, of course, the offerings from Blackmagic. And well, it's quite different from those cameras, I think, and their approach is also quite different. You know, this is obviously the bottom tier of what Sony offer in their cinema line. I would say that's their biggest advantage over the Panasonic GH6. The GH6 is an awesome camera, but it's certainly at its limitations in terms of what a micro four thirds sensor can offer you. There's not really another camera from Panasonic on that system that you can go and upgrade to after you've kind of maxed out what you can do out of the GH6. Like I say, it is an awesome camera. It's more than good enough for most people. Sadly, the autofocus still isn't quite there, but unfortunately it just doesn't have that kind of upgrade path that the Sony definitely offers. It's kind of similar with Blackmagic too. There are certain issues with Blackmagic, like with shorter battery life, obviously no autofocus whatsoever, but there also are some big advantages such as Blackmagic RAW. I think making the choice between the FX30 and a Blackmagic Pocket 6K camera really comes down to a lot of personal choices, what things you want to get out of your camera and what you expect to be able to use it for. Check out my two videos where I compared the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro against the A7IV, which I think is a really good comparison. That a lot of that also applies to the FX30 as well. With the other manufacturers out of the way, how does the FX30 compare and compete with the other offerings from Sony? Well, the most obvious comparison and choice I think most people will be making would be compared to the A7IV, which is exactly the camera that I am shooting this video on. The A7IV is an excellent camera. I think it may be my favorite camera of all time. It's just so versatile. It can do everything. It may not do everything perfect. It has obviously issues with overheating sometimes. Obviously it's got that crop when shooting at 60 frames in 4K, but overall, having a camera that can do great photography, amazing autofocus, good stabilization, full frame sensor, it really does cover such a wide range of use. And it's quite a tough argument to go for the FX30 over the A7IV when they are priced so similarly. After all, you could, if you wanted to, just always shoot in the crop sensor of the A7IV, and effectively that would be the same as shooting as the FX30. Codecs, colors, everything will be very, very similar. The only real difference is that with obviously the A7IV, you could punch out to the full frame when you needed it. And obviously, of course, it gives you that full frame sensor for photography, which is great as well. I think if you are looking for a hybrid solution, then the A7IV is a much better option to go down. Considering they're the same price and considering you're not sacrificing on image quality by going with that over the FX30, I think it's a no-brainer to go with the A7IV. When it comes to the FX3, of course, that is a much more expensive camera and arguably a different discussion to be had. It really just comes down to whether you want full frame or you're happy with Super 35. Now, obviously from a creative standpoint, from having the best technology, from having all the options available when it comes to lenses, and I think probably the most convenient option, which is a 7200 on a full frame, there's just nothing like it. You know, 2.8 is more than enough for interviews, for blowing out the background when you need to, but it still means that you've got a really good zoom range, everything from as wide as you really need for most shoots to as tight as what you often need as well. That's why I love a combination of a full frame camera with a 24-70, and that's something that sadly is really missing when it comes to the Super 35 world. That said, other than that, it is actually quite hard to make the case for the FX3 over the FX30. I think if you look this at on a purely business basis, if you didn't consider creativity, if you didn't consider you know, what camera you want to use and how you want to use the camera, if you just said, look at the numbers, what is the option to go with that's going to make me the most money with the least spend? Well, the FX30 is an obvious choice, really. I mean, there is absolutely nothing wrong shooting Super 35. We've been doing that for years with the likes of the FS5, the FS7. They were great cameras. They're still great cameras being used in TV all the time. And actually in video, sometimes that larger sensor can be an issue. You don't always want that shallow depth of field. So it is still a wonderful option. It also means smaller lenses, lighter setups, which is all big advantages as well, but without having to sacrifice any of the functionality that the FX3 offers. I think there are a few situations where the FX30 makes far more sense than the FX3 or the A7IV. If you're shooting a lot of events, if that's kind of the most of the work you do, and you want multicam all the time, then of course buying two of these is going to make more sense than buying just one FX3. That Super 35 sensor also helps with your telephoto range as well, which is really important for events. I was shooting the other day and needed to shoot cropped so I could actually get the range that I needed. And actually, if you just have that built into the camera, if you're doing lots of events and conferences and you want to use, say, that Sony power zoom lens, which I did a review on, so check out above, that paired with an FX30 doing live events would make tons and tons of sense at a really affordable price. I could see these being very popular in the sort of event coverage world. That smaller sensor also makes a ton of sense with wildlife shooting and sports as well, for very similar reasons. It just gives you that extra telephoto reach without needing bigger and more expensive lenses. Being able to do all that on a cheaper price without sacrificing any of the features that the FX3 has is really awesome. There's only really a couple of negatives of the FX30 that I can really see. The first off being that it's not quite as good in low light. Of course, it's a smaller sensor, so it's not going to have the performance of a full frame sensor in low light. But really, you should be lighting in most situations anyway to get the best image. The other issue for me personally is the lack of viewfinder. I know for most people they don't care and they say that cinema cameras don't need viewfinders, but I just love using a viewfinder with a camera. There's one reason I love using the A7IV. I just find it much more sort of tactile to use than the FX3. Now the FX3 is awesome. It is brilliant. I absolutely love using it, but I just love using a viewfinder, especially when you're in bright conditions and you don't want to have to use a monitor. And even then, reflections on monitors, no matter how bright they get, they never quite give you the same feel as shooting through a viewfinder, at least for me. Does this make sense as a B camera to the FX3 if you say already own one? Well, yeah, it does a lot. Obviously, you're going to have a slightly different look with the different sensor size, although that's not usually a big problem when doing interviews, as you'll want a bit of a different look anyway. It is actually a sharper looking image from what I've seen online, and I think that's just purely down to the fact it's downsampling from that much higher megapixel sensor. That obviously has its pros and cons. It's not something that's really that important. The slightly better dynamic range and the better low light is probably more important on the FX3, so if you were going to pick one or the other, that is a reason to go for the FX3. But if you just wanted a B camera to the FX3, but you didn't want to go down the mirrorless route, then it is a great option. Another big thing that I didn't mention before as well over the A7 IV, of course, is the fact that it has got a built-in fan. So it's not necessarily an easy choice to say, well, if you want to do some photography, then obviously get the A7 IV. The A7 IV is brilliant, and in many cases, it just makes more logical sense over the FX30. But if you're planning on doing lots of long interviews or long shooting, then that fan is really important. If you're doing events or if you're doing long interviews, then although the A7 IV can be okay in those situations, it does feel risky. It always feels risky shooting with anything that doesn't have a built-in fan because they can just overheat out of nowhere. From a professional standpoint, the FX30 looks like a great option. I have to say I am very, very tempted to pick one up. For me, whether we get one, I'm not sure. We'll probably end up getting another A7 IV just because we're doing so much hybrid work nowadays where we need to be able to switch between photo and video. And I think for that, the full frame sensor and the viewfinder for me is more important than necessarily having the safety net of a fan for those kind of shoots. Often they're very short, quick interviews, so the overheating isn't a problem. That said, if it was my only camera, I think the FX30 is a very smart option. It's the same price or a bit cheaper, but it's just going to be very reliable as a video camera, and the smaller sensor really isn't going to be a problem in any of your shoots. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please like and subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos coming up. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.